We have a special guest coming from Harvard University. So Brian Farrell is a biologist who, he was also the director until 2020 of a Latin American Studies group called David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, which is located at Harvard University. And they also have centers in Brazil and I guess also in Mexico and Chile. So they are helping to bring Brian here. And in fact, after this colloquium, he's going to the Pantanal together with a music composer from Harvard University also, who actually happens to be next door giving a concert this afternoon. If people are interested, I think it's at 5:30, the concert. So there's a presentation at 4:15 and then at 5:30. So it's in the electronic music studio. It's called the Panorama Music Studio. So it's just next door for people that are interested. So Brian is, of course, a professor of biology at Harvard University, and he also is curator of entomology at the Museum for
Comparative Zoology.
Comparative Zoology. Yeah. He was professor at Harvard since 1995, and he's visited Brazil a few times, obviously, as director of this center. And he'll be, I guess, back in Brazil. I mean, he's going to Pantanal, and he'll be back in São Paulo for a day, but I guess he won't have time to come back here. So it's a pleasure to have him here now, and I hope he'll be able to come again later. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. Thanks, everyone, for coming. What I'm going to tell you about really is a development from a class that I've been teaching, a freshman seminar. So to first-year students, I've been doing it for about 15 years, and I'm finally getting around to writing it all down. And I'm going to float a version of what I think is an interesting story that connects what I do, which is, natural history and biology of organisms in the wild, connects that to public health and to music. And I also happen to be a percussionist as well, so that explains a little bit of my motivation too. So at any rate, let's get started. There have been a lot of, several books over the past few years about the impact and the history that, and the hold that music has had on us, and had on us for a very long time, as it turns out. And for a reason that I'll share in a moment, there's been a lot of curiosity as to the origins of musicality in humans, and whether or not it might have some precedent in other species. For example, as argued by Bernie Krause, who's a well-known sound artist, or more recently by Henken Henning, who is a cognitive musicologist, who's also asked the same question, but in an experimental setting, working with particular kinds of animals that may or may not be musical. So we'll bring those threads together towards the end of this talk, as you'll see. But here's how I like to start this particular exercise. So imagine I place you in a canoe in the middle of the Pantanal and ask you this question: what kinds of animals are here? Now, do you see any animals? You don't see anything underwater, and you don't see anything above water either. You've only got 10 seconds to answer the exam. Now, if I handed you a recorder and turned it on, you'd capture a soundscape of lots of different kinds of animals. You might hear bats, well, you might not hear, but you would capture, at least record. Bats way up high, you'd hear many different kinds of crickets making these trilling sounds in between, and you'd hear birds and frogs underneath the cricket sounds here at the lower frequencies. So you could actually capture useful data of who's co-occurring at that moment in time in this particular place, and that you could analyze and ask particular questions about their coexistence. So there are lots of singers. There's singers in the air. These are all Pantanal creatures. There's also singers in the water. These are things like fish and, of course, river otters and various kinds of insects. And then there's those that sing in water and air at the very same time. And these are the almost 1,600 kinds of frogs here in Brazil that, whose sounds are attractive both underwater and above water at the same time to different listeners. Why are there so many different kinds of songs? Well, one generalization is that larger animals make deeper tones than smaller animals do. So this is looking across all kinds of mammals and birds. So tiny mice here in this mass range make much higher frequencies than elephants and whales and other large animals. So that's one generalization. There's lots of different kinds of sounds because there's lots of different sizes of animals. But even if you look within particular kinds of animals, you look even within one species of cicada, you find that larger ones make lower tones than smaller ones do. And that's true across frogs as well. Larger frogs have lower voices than smaller frogs do. In fact, some kinds of frogs' tones are also related not just to size, but to temperature. It reflects the ambient temperature outside because they don't thermoregulate. So some frogs seem to cheat by going to the coldest parts of a pond, lowering their voices, so they then seem larger to females, which makes them more attractive. That's a really interesting observation that needs to be followed up. Whatever the pitch, high or low, we can pretty much all hear each other. This is a human hearing range, and this is a range that most other kinds of animals, and mammals and birds and insects all overlap in. We're not able to hear the ultrasound, which many bats and insects use, and some tiny mammals, and we can't hear the lowest frequencies that elephants can make or whales, but we overlap quite a lot, and that's going to be relevant for a reason that I'll show you in a moment. Why this range of frequencies? That's a really good question. I think that has to do with size as well. But let's get to that. Let's defer that for the moment. Good question. So what are we, really? For a musician, what we are percussionists or woodwinds. We're either scraping something, rattling something, or we're forcing air over a membrane, which then vibrates. So we're woodwinds or we're percussionists. Now, why do animals sing? Well, they have lots of motivations. So mainly it's courtship. And this is mainly males singing for females, because in the courtship game, females have much more to lose if they make a mistake in choosing a mate than males do. For number one, their gametes are much more expensive. Number two, they produce fewer of them. Number three, they often invest more post-birth than males do. So it's usually male birds that sing and males of other animals that display, and females make the choices about who to mate with. Some species have duets. We'll talk about that too. Duets, both males and females are calling to each other, and the females are measuring the ability of the male to track their part of the call. And they sometimes, really push the envelope on them. So there's another way that sounds are useful is rivalry. So many males will rival each other through counter singing. One sings a song, another sings a very different song or a louder song, and they'll go back and forth and decide who's the most macho, right? They also sing in choruses. You might have heard choruses of crickets or of frogs, all singing in competition, each one trying to be first, not trying to coordinate with the other, but trying to be the first one that the females hear. So those are competitive group performances, which are called leks. Also, we'll finally, at the very end of this talk about group cohesion, the social connections. Many animals are social. It's not the most numerous origin of social structures to live in society, but it is very successful, as Ed Wilson and others have shown. So we'll talk about that at the end. But why sing for a mate? Well, lots of animals do court, of course, and they might invest in expensive displays, they might give gifts, they might dance, they might produce elaborate, energy-expensive body parts, things to convince females to mate with them. They might combat each other, males against each other. But all of these things are risky and expensive. Acoustic communication is relatively inexpensive. And in fact, you can be hiding while you're doing it. You can be in the bushes, you can be out of sight of females completely, and still be able to effectively communicate your availability and your fitness for mating. So most animals, it turns out, are born with songs. They don't need to practice. A frog sounds the same on day one as it does the day it dies. The same is true with crickets and many other kinds of insects. So lots of animals, in fact most of them, are born with songs that don't need to be practiced, and they don't need any input. These are the non-learners, are things like ducks and chickens and most of the mammals, all the frogs and insects. They all inherit songs that are simple, stereotyped phrases that are produced without practice. But there are learners, especially vocal learners. They're humans, but not other apes, as it turns out, and whales and dolphins, bats, the walrus, and maybe some seals, but over 5,000 birds in three main groups: parrots, hummingbirds, and over 4,500 songbirds. These are things like the canaries and the thrushes. These all learn their songs. They learn them from their parents, and they practice them. So what's going on in the bird brain? Well, it turns out that birdsong is a really sort of useful, interesting behavior that you can investigate from several different perspectives at once. And the zebra finch from Africa has been a most useful model in that. So birdsong allows the use of neurobiology, genetics, molecular studies, and behavior all at the same time to understand this complex communication system that's learned by imitating a model, usually the father. This is what we've known for a long time, and some of the first birds to be experimented on were these white-crowned sparrows from the western United States. So what we've known is that the results of these kinds of experiments. So the first experiment is you take a young hatchling and you allow it to grow up, develop normally in the presence of adults. In fact, and so it develops normally and develops a song that's very much attractive to females. It's very much like the song that it grew up with. So if sparrows are able to hear the correct song when they're young, they can express it when they're adults. But if you rear a young sparrow in isolation, without that kind of input, they never produce the correct song. So they really need to hear it. They have the innate ability to produce the song, but it needs to be trained. So what we've also known for a long time is that they need to practice, and they need to hear themselves practice. So if you deafen these young fledglings, they've heard the correct song when they're young, but then you deafen them, they can't hear themselves practice, they don't develop a normal song. So they need to have that input as well. So songbird songs are both innate and learned, and they require practice, like music does. So they might start off in the first half of the first year, twittering in a sort of experimental way. Then they have a song that can go in any one of a number of directions, but then they produce the structured song that they need to be able to, in order to be able to mate successfully later on. They need to practice it, they need to hear themselves practice, and they need to first hear adults producing that song. Okay, here's what's new. This is from Ben Silvesky in my department, an OEB. He's worked with zebra finches and the neurobiology of zebra finches, tracing parents and offspring through many generations and using the kinds of modern neurobiology techniques that you can to demonstrate something like this, which actually made the popular press. So what he found was that, in fact, what you don't want to do is to copy what you heard exactly. So it turns out that there is a neural mechanism for producing variability in the playback, in what birds are practicing. They produce some songs that are kind of like Dad, kind of a little bit different, and they do all of this variation. It turns out that that's deliberate. It turns out that that practice with variable outcomes is essential to learning, and those with more variability learn faster, and they sometimes produce better songs, more successful songs than they heard. So this is a lecture, part of the lecture I've given at Berklee College of Music, and I'm giving again in a month's time. And I can tell you the music professors are in favor, because it means practice all the time, ignore your mistakes. Some of them will be in a better direction than when you started. So it's an interesting parallel. So many birds are lifelong learners, though, especially minor birds, starlings. I'm not sure if starlings are in Brazil. But they're almost every place else on the planet. They're an invasive species that are actually minors, very good mimics. They'll mimic all of the other birds that they hear. And so does the locally abundant white-browed mockingbird. These are common around here. Or the thrashers. They can produce hundreds of songs. Parts of them are parts of songs that they've heard from other species. Parts of them are elaborations on their own innate phrases and motifs. So they are extraordinarily versatile singers. But are they the best singers? Well, the versatility and beauty are not the same thing. Some of the most famously beautiful, those that are figure in literature and poetry and music, for hundreds of years are the nightingales, of course, and the thrushes and the canaries. The most possibly most beautiful and versatile singer of all is the lyrebird. And I'd invite you to listen on YouTube to lyrebirds on one of the David Attenborough specials. It is extraordinary, the songs that they can produce and the sounds. They mimic things like chainsaws in the forest or trucks driving by or camera motors or whatever they hear. Really quite extraordinary repertoire. So why do adult birds improvise at all? Well, an early researcher at the University of Massachusetts said that it was sometimes to be understood by the neighbors. He was contrasting a pair of sedge wren species. One of them is very sedentary and lives in these marshes, like the Pantanal, in one place all of its life. The other species moves around from one marsh to the next. And it turns out that the sedentary one, they copy what they hear. They copy everybody else, and they can best establish and keep their territories because everybody knows what they're saying. Well, it turns out that the nomadic ones, the ones that move from one place to another, they improvise a lot. And it turns out that that allows them then to communicate whatever territorial birds they encounter wherever they happen to move. So it was an interesting contrast, and it pointed to the the utility of improvisation and also the advantage of being understood. Other birds might choose a deliberately different song. So some male rivalry involves countersinging. Wrens are, again, very famous for this. They will countersing at the edge of their territories. They'll go up to a very high place, so they're sure that other birds will hear them. And they'll hear the song that their rival is playing or singing, and then they'll sing something as different as possible and as loud as possible to enhance the contrast, to convince females that might be watching, well, let's see, who's really the boss of this patch of woods. So it turns out that birds also have the neurobiology to take turns. So this is a nightingale, and this nightingale sings various phrases, one after the other, with pretty short intervals between the phrases. But if it hears other birds singing, it'll take its time. It'll wait and take a turn. It doesn't want to compete. So that's interesting. That means that they have the ability to sort of optimize their performance depending on what they might be overlapping with. The duet thing is very common as well, especially here in tropical places where birds don't migrate. They often stay on their territories for very long periods of time. So we have owls up near us. There are white-browed sparrow weavers in the west that have been studied. Musician wrens are common here in Brazil and throughout the Amazon. And all of these other examples, too. These are duets that are alternating notes of one song or of sometimes different phrases. And they both involve mirror neurons, it turns out. And these are the neurons that fire at the same time as the neurons in some observed individual are firing when they're doing some activity. Might be singing, but it could also be playing basketball, could be playing an instrument. So it's true that watching somebody else do something actually is not as good as practicing it yourself, but it's nothing either. You actually do get some of that wiring reinforced by through the mechanisms of these mirror neurons. It's really quite extraordinary. So at any rate, these neuronal responses to partners can also partly suppress one's own song, so that enforces the taking the turns practice. So duetting involves mirror neurons, and it's helpful in many other things too. We think that it's relevant to empathy, being able to understand what another's feeling or thinking in humans. There's a review in the Annual Review of Psychology that suggests that came out about 14 years ago. But is it music? So the origins of musicality has been a central question, really, and certainly in psychology, and among musicologists and others as well. So this paper came out 2012. Well, we measured those bird songs. We measured the notes. They don't correspond to intervals at all. That's not music. Is that too narrow a definition? It might be, but it could be that we do have too narrow a definition of music, but I'm going to show you an exception, the Holy Grail that has been discovered recently. So it opens the question, is music equal to the use of harmonic intervals? Do we have to use harmonic intervals? Which ones? Or is it the use of repeated motifs combined in different ways with a beginning, a middle, and an end? Maybe we need a more liberal definition of music. And what about rhythm? We'll talk about rhythm in a second. That's the other part. We're talking about melody here, but there's also rhythm, right? So it turns out that 4 years after that last paper was published, this fellow, Heinz Rickner, had published a wonderful study of these. These are called, they're titmice. It's a family of birds. We have chickadees in the north in this family. In Europe, they're called titmice. The great tits have a two-note song. And it turns out that those correspond to musical intervals. It turns out that they use simple ratios, 4/5, some of them are majors, major thirds, etc. And those are the ones that are favored by females, and they're the ones that threaten their rivals the strongest. So it turns out that there is a bird that actually uses musical intervals to convey its quality. And it turns out that that's correlated with a morphological feature that you can see with binoculars. It's the width of this tie that it has going down the center of its breast. The wider the tie, the more the melanin, the more dominant, the more attractive the individual is. And those are the ones that have the simplest intervals, the simplest ratios of the two notes that they sing. Remarkable. There probably are no other examples, but that one's been found. There are even fewer examples, or about the same number, of rhythm. So this colleague of mine, Ani Patel, he's at Tufts University. He was a student of Ed Wilson's. He was his last graduate student. I knew him well. He graduated in 1995. So he works on rhythm and on music and other species. And he was the one who first did an experiment, discovered that while it doesn't look like any other animals actually have rhythm, there is a couple of exceptions. There's this famous cockatoo, Snowball, who was discovered in 2007 to be able to adjust its dance to the rhythm of a song whose rhythm was adjusted by computer, keeping the pitch the same, keeping the pace the same, but adjusted the rhythm. And so that's the one example. Now we think that there's a couple of other parrots, and maybe all parrots are able to do this. And that lent the idea of the vocal learning hypothesis. These are birds that learn to sing. Maybe those are the ones that could also learn rhythm. So we don't know really how general it is, but there is a counterexample. There is a single sea lion found in California which can also rock to a beat. But as far as we know, they're not vocal learners. But even the evidence on that is a little bit mixed now. It looks like maybe there's a walrus and there might be a seal that also can do vocal learning. But these are very few examples. This is kind of the holy grail of musicality in other species. Does anybody do rhythm like we do? Does anybody follow melody? But lots sing, if you admit that singing isn't just using intervals, right? Which is kind of an arbitrary definition of music. So songbirds, it turns out that songbirds and many other animals have perfect pitch. But they don't use it for anything. They can recognize perfect pitch very quickly, much better than we can, although babies can better than adults can in humans. But nevertheless, what they're actually using are not pitches, but the whole shapes of sounds, like somewhat the way newborn humans use the entire shapes of syllables and the stuff that's around them. It isn't necessarily the sequence or any particular pitch. It's the whole sort of package. So at any rate, this came out just a couple of years ago. So songbirds use spectral shape, not pitch, for sound pattern recognition. And yet they have perfect pitch. Interesting. So let's move then from what motivates individuals to what they do in mass when you find many different singers, many different pitches, many different places singing at the same time. So it turns out that forest birds sound very different than grassland birds. They have lower pitches that are able to get around and deal with the interference that leaves and trunks of trees present, as opposed to grassland birds, which have higher pitches, which are able to carry, for a longer distance because there's no interference. So forest birds sound different than grassland birds. So the habitat is relevant also in shaping birdsong and other animals too. And that's because forests sound different than grasslands. And so there's a number of hypotheses on this particular area. So animals that sing in forests and fields compete for bandwidth. Oh, got a little bit of a grammar mistake there. And that's because they can all hear each other. We can all hear each other between 20 and 20,000 hertz. I mean, there's higher stuff and lower stuff, but we overlap an awful lot in what we are able to hear. Insects evolved sound production first of all of these animals, and they're relatively insensitive to vertebrates. They really don't. You really can't shout down a cicada. They'll just keep cranking right on through, as anybody with any experience knows. So how long have animals actually shared a soundscape? Well, this is maybe the halfway point. These are fossils from 125 million years ago. This is a cicada, this is a frog, and this is a katydid, looking very much the way they look today, and this is the number of species there are of each of these in Brazil. So those evolved first. They've been singing for about 250 million years. Some a little bit longer than that, but most right around 250 to 350 million years. They've been on the planet, looking very much and sounding very much. In fact, you can listen to their sounds online, recreations of the fossils with the stridulation plates that they use. It's really quite remarkable. So when they evolved long before the vocal learners did, long before birds. Singing birds evolved maybe 65, 70 million years ago, very recently, in other words. And the most elaborate singing birds evolved even more recently since. Now, the Earth was mostly tropical until the Oligocene period. That's about 30 to 40 million years ago when the continents moved to pretty much their current position. The Earth cooled quite a lot. Grasslands started to form, the great savannas, and the poles formed with very cold regions, very dry regions, which insects just never have invaded as fully as they have the tropics. Birds, on the other hand, radiated into those new habitats and filled the acoustic niches that were left empty. This is a recording in the Pantanal during the daytime. And you can see at the top, these are the insects here up between, somewhere between 2.7 and 10 kilohertz. These are all, if this was a darker room, you would see that there's a solid band of about 10 or 12 different cricket species. Down here below the insects are the birds. So birds mostly sing below 2.7 kilohertz in these tropical habitats. Well, insects dominate above. But if you were to go up to the Arctic, you go up to high latitudes, you find the insects are missing, and that's where the birds are. The birds fill those habitats. Now, most of us who sort of work in this area have sort of known this kind of intuitively for quite a long time, that singing insects are absent at high latitudes, and so the birds there sound like insects because they can. Even frogs sing underneath the insect din in the Pantanal. So here's the insects up here, and there's the frogs underneath. But this study came out about 10 years ago, which was a quantitative demonstration, and I'd invite you to look at it for greater detail, to show that, where insects are present in these forest ecosystems, whether it's north or south, open or closed habitats, the birds avoid them, basically. So this is a quantitative demonstration of that effect that I just showed you. I published a paper last year with folks in our engineering department and applied math to show that, in fact, if you take into account body size, these different habitats, including Rio Cristalina here in Brazil, show evidence of acoustic competition. The birds avoid each other as well as avoiding insects. So that just came out, but I'm not going to go into the details now. So let's move on to the piece in animals that will be the bridge then getting into human musicality. That song enables social cohesion in other species as well as our own. Lots of species are social. Famously, many whales, the elephants, of course, the herding animals, wolves, etc. They all use vocal communications to keep in touch with each other. And many non-social animals even share warning calls. So, it's remarkable that birds and insects can understand each other's warning calls that there's an aerial predator or there's a ground predator because they have very different sounding calls. You don't want to use an easily localized warning call if you are trying to warn about an aerial predator because they can find you. If it's a ground predator, no problem. You stay up in the trees, right? But you want to warn everybody. So that's interesting. There's this cross-species communication. Well, that's a bit of a side issue, but at any rate, I wanted to mention that social cohesion is important. And elephants can learn, this just came out, elephants learn new sounds to stay in touch with each other. Some sound like trucks. Dolphins, and this is very new, learn each other's names. They actually have sonic signature whistles, that each one unique, and they learn each other to call each other by name. They also have particular names for objects in their environment. So we're not smart enough to know how smart dolphins are. Really quite extraordinary. We have known about whales, though, for the longest time. People going out, fishermen going out off the coasts of North America and of Europe for thousands of years have heard the sounds of whales coming up through the thin-skinned bottoms of their boats. But it wasn't until 53 years ago that someone had the attention to notice that those aren't just sounds, they repeat themselves. Now, you've got to be out for a long time to notice the repetition. So in 1971, this paper by Roger Payne and Scott McVeigh changed the way the world thinks about whales. Here's Roger. He just passed away last summer, tragically, in Vermont. at the end of a really transformational life. Before that paper, he published The Songs of Humpback Whales. They were the first ones to record whales using the old-fashioned kind of ink on paper drum recorders that they carried out on sailboats. They would record the whales and then they'd tape together all of those recordings across the floor, and they were the first to notice that they repeat. So they have motifs at beginnings and ends and middles. They're somewhat varied, but they're regular repetitions. So they thought, these are songs, right? So there they are. These are these various song sessions. And it turns out that we know a lot about these now. There are different dialects. There are different songs in different places. Each individual whale has a song that it elaborates. There's a signature for a particular place. There are dialects. We know quite a lot about these repetitive phrases. They copy each other. They copy each other's songs and sometimes steal songs and use them to elaborate their own repertoires. So they improvise. And this just came out. They are, in a way, like jazz singers. So they're not just repeating some series of motifs that they do year after year or even day after day within a single season. They improvise using their sort of cognitive machinery to be able to elaborate and change the phrasing in recognizable ways. It's really quite extraordinary. So that's a new discovery. Yes? We don't know enough about that, honestly. It's not known what they're communicating, if anything. And in fact, they're mostly whale boy bands. It's not obvious that females are listening at all. They're playing for each other. Don't know what it means. Some great point. We're going to get to that point. Possibly they have some way of measuring quality. Yeah, it's really an interesting subject. So there are revolutions in whale cultures that will play particular motifs in particular places, in particular seasons, and then some song from Australia comes in, the whales will grab it, and they'll completely change their repertoire. There'll be a revolution in local music, whale music, for a time, for that year. It's really quite extraordinary. They steal foreign riffs. So how did this all lead to human music, you might ask? These are a couple of popular cartoons showing that maybe drums are older than strings, and they probably are. That doesn't mean they have less impact on human biology, as we'll see. So this is a very popular topic, of course, as you can imagine. And the fire was lit really by my colleague Steve Pinker, who threw down the gauntlet about, I guess about almost 30 years ago, suggesting that music is really just an artifact, a consequence of having a brain that's really shaped for language, which is, of course, what Steve studies. That, as you can imagine, he actually extended it to art as well. Couldn't understand that art could be, or music, an adaptive feature in the evolutionary history of Homo sapiens, thinking rather that it was a recent invention that just took advantage of a brain that was complex because it built these other things, and so therefore it was amenable to creating this entertainment. That started quite a controversy among music cognitions, musicologists, and the like. There are a number of books that came out and documentaries, The Music Instinct, Musicophilia, etc., The Art Instinct, and more. And for all of the evidence that I'll show you in a moment from brain science and from public health, lots of different kinds of studies, I think one of the best arguments was really made by this fellow, Brian Boyd, in The Origin of Stories, who said, the problem with Pinker's argument is that he's thinking like a consumer of art and music. But to have art, you have to produce it in order to react to it. So that's the real question. Why do we have this instinct to produce art and music? Not why do we have a response to it? Which I thought was an interesting turn of the argument. But nevertheless, there's quite a lot of scientific investigation by folks like Oliver Sacks and Dan Levitin up at McGill University, showing that the neurobiology of music suggests ancient origins. It involves much more of the brain than language does, many more different and older parts. It also involves the production of neurotransmitters, as we'll see, dopamine, serotonin, the reward hormone, plus oxytocin, the bonding hormone, and endorphins, which we all know about as well. There have been some quantitative studies of the neurobiology of our responses, our personal responses are individual responses to particular kinds of music that we like. So it turns out that you can, by administering radioactive sugar to individuals and then measuring which of the brain centers are illuminated when one scores music that you're hearing with a high score or a low score or a certain amount of money or a lesser amount of money, you're scoring and ranking. It turns out that your brain lights up in perfect correspondence with how you subjectively weigh your preferences or register your preferences, particular kinds of music. Now, this study came out, 15 or so years ago, so there might be some of you who recognize these bands: Neighbors, Cut Copy, Lo-Fi Fink. I don't know any of them, but nevertheless, you could probably repeat that experiment today and find a very similar answer. Now, this is not a new idea. Darwin suggested, in fact, that music might precede language. There might be some kind of a musical proto-language that was useful for, at least for attracting and maintaining bonds with mates, and I think it's more general than that, probably also useful for fostering the social cohesion of small groups struggling against each other and against the environment, which is basically how we've spent most of the last million years. But at any rate, we can see the traces of a long history already in the fossil record and in the archaeological record. The past isn't dead, it isn't even past. Witness these flutes, the great care taken in shaping a flute from ivory, following a pentatonic scale. You can actually listen to this playing familiar songs, online. I'd recommend The Cave of Forgotten Dreams by Werner Herzog. That's a great documentary that is mostly about those great paintings of Chauvet, but it also includes a bit on the musical instruments found in caves nearby. This even might be a 55,000-year-old Neanderthal flute. There's one thing that I've discovered about archaeology and paleontology is that everything is older than we think it is. Things don't get younger with new discoveries, they get older, which is a consequence of the arrow of time, right? But it's really quite remarkable. There's two great theories, rival theories about the origins and the motivations of early music. Was it sex or was it sociability? Here's some 37,000-year-old bone flutes. The first were ivory. These are carved out of bone, again following a pentatonic scale, which is the most widespread on the planet today. But Steve Mythen at the University of Reading argued almost 20 years ago that it was both sex and sociability. And he coined this kind of cute model, the model, that holistic, multimodal, manipulative, musical, and mimetic was basically the suite of traits that evolved even in Neanderthals to be able to reinforce social bonds within groups that were struggling against the environment, against other groups, and following leaders and producing leaders at the same time. What's remarkable, I think, are some of the work by Igor Reskinov and Michel Devois of the Université de Paris. They showed that, if you walk into those great cave systems, whether it's Altamira or it's Lascaux or Chauvet, not all of the rooms are decorated with paintings, just the acoustically resonant ones. So we've been together listening in rooms to music for 125,000 years or longer. We've been doing this for a very long time. That's the vision. I think that's really quite extraordinary. This was discovered just a few years ago, 2016, apparently ritual placement by Neanderthals. Again, this is long before our Homo sapiens sapiens. The apparently ritual use of stalactites to form a circle deep inside a cave. As I say, things are getting older. Neanderthals, now there's evidence of art, geometric designs up to over 100,000 years old. So I think really that a sense of tribal coherence is advantageous when these small social groups, such as we formed, are competing for resources with each other or they face hardships. How better to get people on the same page if you need to migrate across the plains? Give them a sophisticated, syntactically correct argument, or beat the drums, get the flutes going, get everybody excited. Oh yeah, we're going, I think that makes sense to me. That came first. So music fosters social cohesion. Now, let's look at music today. it turns out that music and the responses are universal and innate. There's no society that doesn't have music. And all of those musics share many features in common. We know that infants of one culture respond, relax in response to unfamiliar foreign lullabies that they've never heard. This all started at Harvard a few years back in the Department of Psychology, and it's just moved last year over to the University of Auckland. So let's look at cultural evolution and revolution in human music. So this is the music lab that started here at Harvard. It's moved now to the University of Auckland following its founder, Samuel Mayer, who worked with Elizabeth Spelke in the Department of Psychology and became a faculty associate afterwards. And its coordinate is at the Yale School of Medicine, the Child Study Center. So basically, they've got a database of 5,000 different performances from all over the world, and their descriptions from all these different societies, and they code these into different variables, and then they study what's in common and what makes sense. And what they found was that music regularly supports particular kinds of behaviors. Maybe it's, mothering, maybe it's war, maybe it's lullabies, maybe it's dance, but they have particular features that correspond to those. These always involve words and dance and tonalities and aesthetics, it turns out. So this is just a scatter diagram from that paper in Science, which shows that, the dance kinds of dance songs, wherever they occur, always are complex rhythmically. While lullabies are always simple. Healing songs are of one sort, and other songs are of another. So that's what that basically says. So this leads me then back to the idea of, back to ecology, the ecology of other species. We know a lot about the evolution of key innovations. Something new happens in a group of species, like birds evolved wings early on, let's say. Animals evolved terrestriality or an eggshell, and those opened lots of opportunities and produced the radiations of species that we see today. Could there be something equivalent, key innovations into music spaces? Well, this is the story of human evolution and migration as we know it today. So every school child knows that we all began in Africa 200, 300,000 years ago, maybe. It keeps getting older and older. And that we moved maybe more than once into Europe and then across Eurasia and eventually into the Americas. And now the latest is that maybe that might have been twice as long ago as anybody thought. It might be as long as 23,000 years ago. Well, the other thing about that a biologist noticed about a story like this is two things. One is that in all else being equal, in most ecosystems, time produces diversity. Diversity needs time to accumulate. We also know that when small propagules, small satellites emerge from a particular large population to another place, they don't carry all the diversity that they originated with. And so there's a bottleneck effect, basically, a decrease in diversity. And it turns out that if you look at human genetics and human language use and rhythms too, you see that very same effect across the planet with distance from Africa. Genetic diversity declines with distance. So it's lowest here in the Americas, which is what opened the door for the great infections that arrived with the Europeans. Genetic diversity of resistance was very low, because this was a bottleneck that produced a relatively narrow genetic range of variability within the first inhabitants of the Americas. Diversity of language sounds also decreased away from Africa. And these are the diversity in Africa of language sounds, and the diversity in Oceania and South America much lower. And you can see this, again, the graph of distance from Africa. So it turns out that rhythms follow the very same pattern. So the first Americans, the first indigenous people to establish themselves here, brought these instruments that were described by the first, the first Spaniards and others, these simple slit drums and flutes, pentatonic scale again, and rattles and ocarinas and the like. So that's what was here until about 500 years ago. And it turns out that innovation then proceeded with the arrivals of two groups of people. First, those who brought the Baroque brass and strings from Europe, and then those who forcibly were brought over and brought along their complex rhythms from Africa, including these instruments, the gankakui and the shekere and the bata, and the rhythms that go with them, and the societies. And what you ended up with by combining those European sort of instruments with the African rhythms is a remarkable diversification of musics in the Americas. Bachata, merengue, rumba, salsa here, and condombe, samba, bossa nova, and lots more. All of them with a common African rhythm. And in fact, it's so diverse now that there have been recent efforts to show that, yes, these are diverse musics, but man, they're all based on the same complex, semi-complex African rhythms. I say semi, and I'll show you why in a second. So this early music scholar from the New England Conservatory of Music, writing, quite a long time ago now, suggested that there's African rhythms have been pretty well documented and pretty well studied. In fact, their first documentation is over almost 2,000 years old in ancient Arabic manuscripts. The ones that survived in jazz were the simpler ones because they could be adapted to European rhythmic conceptions. They weren't the most complex. They were the intermediate complexity, and we'll see why that's important in a second. So what were the rhythms from Africa? Well, clave, which you all know, and I'll show you in a second, began in Africa as a slightly more complicated Bembe rhythm, and these other Yoruba polyrhythms in Ewe-speaking Ghana, Nigeria, and their neighbors. So these are the parts of West Africa where drum societies predominated and are still abundant today. So the Ewe-speaking people were widespread, and their cross-rhythm drums and dance were fundamental to society. These weren't separate crafts that separate craftsmen produced. These are things that united a society. And this is very well elaborated and explained by C.K. Legzekpo and his family. He was at Berkeley for many, many years, and some wonderful YouTube videos of him explaining the Ewe approach to life and the origins of these cross rhythms, especially these 3/2 patterns. Are there any musicians in the audience today? Yeah, there are a few. Okay, so this part's for you. So there's some really extraordinary documentation. So the simplest rhythm that they played was a simple. This is the Bembe rhythm. So that is the basis of clave, as I could also show you, if you can hear this. I'll need both hands for this, but right? You all know clave rhythm. The son clave, which came from the Yoruba originally, and ended up developing into the dance rhythm, which is, I think, the most ubiquitous beat on the planet. And I'll show you that in a second as well. So here are the various versions of clave, the rumba clave and the son clave with the 3-side and the 2-side. And so you can trace the beats and what's dropped off until you get down to the basic dance beat that everybody knows. Let's see if I can, I'll just do it on the table here. Right? What I'm doing with my left hand, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, and this is, go back and listen to rap and listen to any hip hop on the radio now, and you'll hear that very same rhythm, which goes back 500 years to a slightly more complex Bembe rhythm. I think it's very exciting and very extraordinary to see the continuity of this signal, and I don't think it's a coincidence, and I'll show you why. So it entered popular music with the first recordings. This was Solace, 1909, a habanera, which had the Spanish tinge as Scott Joplin and the other writers described at the time. It's present in Shave and a Haircut, 2 bits. That's a rhythm. You've heard that before, right? It's in every culture with different words, but it's a clave rhythm, originated with the Ewe people. And it's not a coincidence that it is so pervasive, as we'll see. Jelly Roll Morton was one of the first to publish it in jazz, 1915. Danzón in Cuba by Antonio Romeo. Donga, who you've all heard of, right? With the very first, some of the first recordings hosted by Leopold Stokowski of samba back in 1917. It took over the world. Bo Diddley introduced it into American rock music and popular music with, his Willie and the Hand Jive, then Magic Bus by The Who, then Faith by George Michael in the 1980s, Boom Boom Pow by Black Eyed Peas, and it just continues every year. There's some, hit on the radio that uses the clave beat. Even America.
Okay, by me in America, everything's free in America, for a small fee in America.
Clave. Not a coincidence. So why is the clave rhythm so popular? There's been a fair bit of study of this as well. It turns out that there's a sweet spot between predictability and surprise. So a rhythm, if it's too regular, if it's a march, 1, 2, 3, 4, that loses interest after a while. If it's too complex, that also is chaos and can't be assimilated. But if it's somewhere in between, moderately syncopated, and that's the key word with clave rhythms, is this tension between the 3-side and the 2-side, that's what hooks people. So we already know that infants prefer the teddy bear that they rock in time with. We know that we're predisposed to rhythm, to beat perception. And it turns out that drumming together fosters bonding among people. If you drum together in sync, you become more pro-social. You do this experiment where some people drum in sync with the participants, others deliberately drum out of sync. You drop a bunch of pencils on the floor. How many they pick up reflects how kindly they're feeling towards you. Those that drummed in sync with you are feeling more kindly. They pick up more of the mess. Interesting, ingenious, simple experiment by the social psychologists. It turns out that a swing feel, this kind of syncopation, is processed like speech. It uses both the music cognition centers and the language centers. So tapping polyrhythms, that's what clave is, and music activates the language areas as well. So it introduces the question, is music language or is language music? I've actually thought that you all remember there was this great dust-up when Bob Dylan was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. Because music isn't literature, well, they were right. They had it backwards. I think that literature, language, is simply a very sophisticated way of using syntax and semantics to deliver a message which is encoded in music, but maybe most detailed in language. So it's just a very sophisticated kind of narrowed music that uses the rhythm and the power of that prosody to convey specific ideas. Music is more general and probably original. So yes, I think language is music, really. Jazz drumming is like complex syntax, it turns out. And playing together, this is here at USP, just came out, showing that playing drums together in music therapy is very effective. Builds both social, mental, and physical health. We've long used the power of music to heal, as described in ancient literature from Mesopotamia to the Baroque, from mysticism to brain science. And we need this now, perhaps more than ever, because the world is ever more stressful. So I want to just show you what the impact is of social connection and its absence in human society. I read this paper about 15 years ago, and it came out 2009 by Steve Cole of UCLA. We'd all known for a long time that individuals under dire circumstances in hospitals, long-term care, those who have many visitors have much better prognoses, do much better than those who are socially isolated. Well, these guys investigated. They wanted to find out what was going on. And so what they did was they went in and they tracked 14 older adults over 4 years. They registered how many visits they get, how connected they were, and they took blood samples from them, and they measured over 200 genes, the expression of immune system genes, 2/3 of them, and then inflammation response genes. And of course, it's the inflammation response that usually kills us in the end. It turns out that the socially lonely had their immune response genes at low expression. They were down-regulated by 30%. The inflammation response genes were upregulated, and it's the reverse in the socially connected. So there's a 30% difference in levels of gene expression between the lonely and the socially integrated. That's why connection matters. Now, just a couple of years ago, actually 2016 now, this study came out with even more detail. So this is an experiment. You can't experiment with humans, but you can experiment with macaques. So it turns out that if you take troops of macaques and you introduce young females one at a time into the troops, and then you take blood samples from them, what you find is that the first female who's introduced is given a higher social rank by the troop than the second female introduced. You take blood samples, and the first female's higher social rank results in a upregulation of genes giving her stronger antivirals. The second, the one with lower social status, has the antibacterial genes because she's living a harder life, basically a more stressful life. So there are consequences of social rank in macaques, and this is over thousands of genes. Yeah. Yes, everything is better at higher rank, absolutely. And so that has been called by the popular press the biology of inequality, and it basically has to do with our capacity, our resilience for response to stressors, whether they're physical, physiological, or psychosocial, which is as important as the others. So status alters immune function in macaques, and there's a popular piece by Robert Sapolsky about this. So it's really an extraordinary finding. Now, that of course, then led me personally into the stress literature, and this is the fellow who just passed away few years ago, 2020, Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University, who knew more about stress than anybody else on the planet. He was the first to discover that you all know what cortisol is. Cortisol is, right, the stress hormone that our brain releases, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal glands. It's released, and it's what musters the glucose and gets the energy so that you can lift up the truck off of the infant, or you can respond to a stressful situation. Well, what he discovered was that there are cortisol receptors in our brains as well, and so our brains actually also sort of respond to that cycle of stress response. That was about 20 years ago, and it really changed the way we think about stress. We can talk about stress afterwards if you'd like. He wrote a wonderful book about 20 years ago now, The End of Stress as We Know It. That's a bit of an optimistic. The key is that as we knew it, right? So stress is something that we know more about now. And it's interesting because he passed away. There was a wonderful Festschrift volume to him in the months afterwards, and I have to say that this was a fellow who was really connected to his community and well-loved, and I thought it was an extraordinary tribute to somebody who knows the most about stress, lived the kind of life that you should live if you know about stress, because he had 1,000 collaborators and a zillion students. This was an engineer who knew how to be a pilot, too. I think it's really quite an extraordinary person. So at any rate, one of his most well students is Robert Sapolsky, who wrote this, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. The reason is because they're not, unlike cows, they're not separated from their mothers at birth, right? And they might worry about lions, but the biggest worry for them and all of us is the social connection, the social status, really. So they feel connected, and so they don't get ulcers while cows do. Oliver Sacks, of course, has highlighted this in several of his most recent books, the effects of music and connection. And this is what his conclusion is that there's only two things that we can do outside of pharmaceutical therapy that have any effect on neurological diseases: music and gardens. And I'll talk about gardens next time, but we're going to talk about music today. So music lowers cortisol after a stressful event. We've known this for some time. Here's the stressful event. Here's the cortisol levels. They spike normally in the silent conditions, and if there's music, they rise, but much less dramatically. We've known that for 20 years, thanks to Bruce's work. Music and dance participation, they build health resilience in lots of different populations, and this is a survey across a great diverse swath of humanity. So the effect is very general. Singing is the most effective group bonding activity that we know of. Arts engagement in general prolongs life. We know about this from longitudinal studies of aging. Children musicians have thicker corpora callosa, and that's the connection between your right brain and your left brain, than other children who don't take music early on. And it turns out that if you look, this just came out in 2020 from the University of British Columbia. They measured this music performance or music engagement and exams in math, science, and English in musicians and non-musicians of varying degrees of engagement. And it turns out that music in general lifts exam scores by several points in all of these ways that we measure. And instrumental music is even better than vocal music, but all music is effective. Really quite extraordinary. So that's possibly a consequence of these better connected brains, they will argue. And these are the social brain in music, of course, involves lots of different pieces, involving the auditory nuclei as well as the cognitive centers and every place else. It involves centers all over the brain. So you can knock out language with a blow to the side of the head. Music is impossible to erase, even as Oliver Sacks showed early on, and as that was celebrated in the movie Awakenings with Robin Williams, even severely impaired patients can awaken to the strain of music that they knew when they were young. And starting early is key. So priming is the social psychology word for engaging people early on to respond more strongly later on to stimuli that are the same. And that can be negative as well as positive. Early trauma produces a greater proliferation of cortisol receptors in your brain, so you're more sensitive to anxiousness and the like. On the other hand, if you have positive early experiences of social connection one way or another, it builds resilience as well. Okay, so music we know lowers heart rate, blood pressure, and anxiety before surgery, and it makes for better surgeons. Music improves surgical performance, and classical is even better than dance music, it turns out. No surprise, I suppose. Music reduces postoperative pain, anxiety, and analgesia use. Music lowered cortisol after 5 years, and 5-year mortality for patients under dialysis. Listening. Playing is even stronger, but it's hard to get patients, and not everybody's playing, and surgeons certainly aren't playing. Music lowers depression. During COVID, of course, people came out of their windows, right, and out of their doorways and sang and played together. So that really highlighted the power, the social bonding effects of music, an associated role of oxytocin then. Oxytocin is the bonding hormone that's elevated between infants and children by a gaze. And it turns out that, this is an aside, but it turns out that if you own a dog, you look in a dog's eyes, you both get oxytocin bumps. It's important. These social connections, they're extraordinary. And music is one avenue to elevate those and build our resilience to stress. So we know that music and art are also effective in building health. Music aids in postoperative recovery. Oxytocin is maybe nature's medicine. It's this anti-inflammatory for the nervous system that's facing stress, and it promotes the social bonding effects of music. So there's lots of literature on oxytocin now as well. So this is the idea, circling back to our original observation. This sense of tribal coherence is advantageous when small social groups compete for resources and face hardships, induces this feeling of feel-good neurotransmitters. This is what it's done for maybe 1 million years. And so it's no coincidence that, we can take advantage of that now. It's no coincidence that in societies in Africa that were centered on social drumming, they discovered that these particular kinds of rhythms promoted social connection, and that discovery resulted in the popularization of those rhythms when they were exported, so that they dominate the world today. I think that's directly because of their pro-social effects. So a new idea for 2023 came from these folks in Osaka, Japan. Testosterone, oxytocin, and cooperation. Basically, their idea is that by mediating oxytocin and testosterone, music fosters cooperation. It lowers testosterone in males, and it produces a boost in oxytocin, basically. It does elevate testosterone in females, incidentally. But apparently, and they explain that by virtue of its role in motivating, bonding and guarding between mother and child. But, you'd have to read the paper to understand that. So it does look, finally, my final slides are these, that folks who have looked at societies that have been sedentary for a very long time, now most people are moving all over the place in airplanes, but if you look at folks who've been pretty much stayed put for the last 1,000 years, those that are musical are ahead in public health outcomes compared to their counterparts elsewhere in the Arctic and in Japan or in Taiwan. Those particular peoples who have particular music cultures have a genetic structure and a history that's different than language and maybe older and beyond. It just suggests that music and humans have co-evolved for a very, very long time. And so humans and other animals have used song for bonding to each other as mates or in groups. We singing animals evolved through improvisation, and our nervous systems spur creativity in response to novelty. Music is both cultural, art, and biological connection, mediated by perception and consciousness. Music is a potent biocultural bridge offering respite, remedy, and resilience in a stress-filled world, and that's why we sing. That's what I have to say. Thank you.
I can ask a question. So you talked about music as being intervals. So
Yeah.
that was one way to define. But, I mean, just you don't need life to have intervals. So a piece of wood also resonates at intervals. So a woodwind instrument, for example. So isn't it more natural for a bird to sing with intervals just because it's just the resonant cavities of the voice?
Well, at intervals that are simple intervals.
Okay.
That's the idea. They're 5/4, 5/3. They're not more complicated, right? So the ratios don't have to be even rational numbers. They could be much more complicated than that, right? And the proportions don't have to be simple ones. So the surprise was that there were simple proportions like musical intervals are. But you're right. The other thing about intervals is it's surprising that there are different scales and different uses of microtones and the like in different parts of the world, but there's not that many of them. You know, there's really, you know, like maybe a half dozen or 8 systems of musical intervals worldwide. And there could be thousands, but there aren't. There's a handful, which is interesting, I think, also. So, but good point. Yeah, every sound has a harmonic series in some sense, and so there are intervals, but the idea is that these are simple intervals, which was the surprise.
I actually have a question in the same vein of thought,
Yeah.
because you said that the first instruments that you found, like the humans built it or Neanderthals built it, were the pentatonic scale. And what makes it important? Like, why is the pentatonic scale? Why do we make music in this scale in particular?
I have no idea.
Because I always thought that, because when we hear a song that doesn't follow the right rhythm, we find it weird, but I thought it was cultural, because we started making music that way, and therefore we find it natural, but it could be the other way around.
No, it could be. No, that's true. Yeah, I have no idea. You know, I really don't. Just cultural passing things along, and why are there so few music systems in the world instead of, why is there the number that there is and not some higher number? You know, I think it's maybe a similar explanation. It's sort of, you know, groups reinforce each other, you know, by the communication that they can establish through these using of these scales. But I think it is astonishing. I think it surprised everyone to find that those were tuned, basically instruments. Yeah, good question. Open question.
Yeah, I've heard that people that struggle with speech or have some impairing in the speech, they like stuttering or Tourette syndrome or something like that. Mm-hmm. They usually understand better when we sing, and they also talk better when they sing. What does have to say about the relation between speech and singing?
You know, many have highlighted that same relationship, that we can learn to sing our thoughts if we lose the ability to speak, and that music therapy helps children with speech impairments. I think it speaks to the role of rhythm and prosody in the development of language. And that, I think, supports the idea that maybe music is more fundamental.
Yeah,
but you're absolutely right. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, I also saw one study that says that it's much more rare to see someone with music impairments than with speech impairments.
That's right. Yeah, I was just reading a book that a review of this subject. Yeah, they were identified throughout their long career. This group was able to identify one person, who was amusic. Basically could not detect beats and could not distinguish between melodies. But yet aphasia is far too common. So yeah, it's a very good point. I think all points to the same thing. I think the music is older and more ingrained, maybe more fundamental.
So when animals are searching for food in the forest, they can produce sounds to communicate with each other, and these can actually make the search faster, essentially.
Good point.
So what's the importance of communicating music like that or sounds like that?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent observation. So I spoke of singing at the beginning in a very general way, meaning communication, right? But clearly there's also a more narrow view about melody and about rhythm. And of course, communication itself is broad, and it's sometimes acoustic. It can be through scent. It can be through visual displays. I don't know that all acoustic communication is relatable to music per se, except in the most general way, that it's acoustic communication and it conveys information, often an emotional state. Maybe it's excitement, maybe it's richness of resource, calling in the troops, warning others, general emotional content. A friend of mine who lives in our neighborhood, actually, who's a very famous Jewish composer, he said, I agree with you about music, but I wish it was more sort of precise. Our emotional content is pretty diffuse. It's happy or it's sad or it's excited or it's something else. But, it reminds me of my sister-in-law, and when somebody asks, "Can you explain your painting?" If I could explain it, I would have written it. Right? So wrong medium, in other words. So I don't know. I think we can overthink and try to transduce, information from one into another. With animal communication, I think that just being able to have structures that used the medium that we're in, it's air, could be inside wood. Lots of animals communicate inside wood, burrowing beetles and ants and the like, and others underwater. There are various constraints and advantages of those media, but it's all communication using pressure waves, right, of the medium. And music is one of those things too, so it's a subset. So not all sound is music, but all music is sound.
So I don't know if you mentioned this in passing during the talk, but has anybody looked into humans' reaction to like bird songs and so on?
Oh, yeah.
And the reverse, like animals reacting to music.
Great question. So yes, the other thing that I'm working on now, writing about biophilia, is the effect of humans to nature experiences. Very much the same as far as cortisol, stress release, heart rate, and the like. And birdsong is a major stimulus of those feelings, those responses in humans. Whether birds care about us, there was a Harvard grad, class of '83, your class, I think it was, named David Rothenberg at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. There's some great YouTube videos and some papers that he wrote, playing a clarinet to a hydrophone underwater to whales, and the recordings are the whales and the clarinet. I play it for my class every year. They're ignoring him. He did the same thing with birds, Sharma birds over in India, but I don't think they just don't, they don't, this book, one of the books I showed you early on, animals just don't register, they don't listen the way we do. They listen to different elements than we do, So we somehow have cued on to rhythms and intervals and stuff, and they're paying attention to something else. They're processing it in a different way. So, yeah, I don't think we can ever expect them to respond to us that way. But it's a good try, I think. It's a good experiment to do. brilliant, really. Hey, it's raining.
Yeah, good for us. Any questions? Okay, so let's thank Brian again for a very entertaining talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Nathan. Yeah, thank you. A lot of material.
Yeah, we could have got more music people here. It would have been interesting to start a dialogue.
Yeah. I wasn't sure.